Dear What Lurks Beneath, this is the first of letters that I plan to write you so that you can read it on your channel. I am incredibly grateful that you've given me the chance and the platform to share some of my experiences hunting the darker creatures of this world. I understand that you may not read this, but I'm happy just to even have the chance to get it out there. Honestly, thank you for that. Anyway, this is where it all begins. So, where to start? I have to say, I'm not very good with most technology, but my girlfriend is helping me out. Plus, I can write just fine, so I think this will work out alright. I suppose I'll start by introducing myself. My name is Sam White Owl. Not your usual name, I know, but I'm half Cherokee. So, there you have it. I'm a 47-year-old man, and let me tell you, I'm definitely feeling my age. Many people in my line of work don't make it this far, though, and I will always be grateful that I've been around as long as I have. Now, you might be wondering what exactly my aforementioned line of work is, and it's difficult to explain. I've never had to tell anyone quite like this, but I'm getting old, and I figured it's time that people should know. I am what is simply known as a hunter. Capital H. If you're thinking camouflage clothing, big rifles and deer stands, well, you're not terribly far off. In some cases, of course. I enjoyed that usual sort of hunting too, but I'm really talking about hunting. Other things. The things that inspire nightmares and make you scared of the dark. This world is home to things that many people don't believe in or understand. But in my culture, we've known about some of these creatures for millennia, and it's been my family's job for some time to deal with them. These things are what we know as cryptids, creatures, or more simply, monsters. The Hunters, capital H, are a worldwide organization dedicated to helping humanity coexist peacefully with monsters. It's not our job to keep these creatures secret or to hide them from you. In fact, I think most of the world like it if the modern world would just wake up and start acknowledging the fact that these creatures are real. Unfortunately, in most societies today, people simply don't listen to the old tales, and that makes a hunter's duties that much harder. But I do those duties nonetheless, because I believe it's the right thing to do. As a hunter, I live my life job to job, taking tasks where they come up, and traveling to different locations, dealing with monsters in each place. Sometimes, hunters are able to resolve things peacefully. Many monsters are not inherently aggressive, and can be reasoned with, or otherwise handled without bloodshed. I like these cases the best, because nobody gets hurt, and I walk away without a new set of scars. But other times, the situation gets violent, and hunters are forced to fight. And that's what we do best, if I'm being honest here. Many hunters are not as willing to take the diplomatic approach as I am, and when push comes to shove, we shove hard. We hunters are a fairly loose organization as far as these things go. We don't have a great deal of bureaucracy or restriction, which is nice, but can also be annoying when it comes to organizing things or getting resources. For example, there are some great custom weapon makers in the deep south of the United States, but they're tough to reach out without contacting them directly. It's not like we have hunter weapons depots stacked with their stuff, but it wouldn't be my job to get those weapons if they were readily available. That's because most hunters have a guide. A guide is somebody who liaisons with the hunter organization at large and sniffs out potential jobs and cases. My guy is an older guy named Sergio, who used to be a hunter on the ground himself before he started working as a guide. I think he was partnered with at least 2 other hunters before he came to me, which goes to show how short hunter careers can be sometimes. Anyway, that's enough logistics. If you'd like to know any more about me or my hunting in general, feel free to ask in the comments or however else. I'd be glad to give you more information. But right now, I'd like to talk more about what I suppose you're all here for. The monsters. I've heard lots of stories, both here and in other places online, about people's experiences with cryptids, and many of them seem quite true to my own experience and knowledge. I've hunted quite a lot of creatures in my time, and I've encountered pretty much all of the common North American monsters and cryptids. If you have any questions about any creatures in particular, be sure to let me know. I suppose I'll start talking about some specific monsters. This will be part survival guide, part personal account. I'll try to explain what each creature is, what it is not, and how to deal with it, before talking about my own personal experiences with it. If I haven't had any encounters of my own, then I'm sure I can find some testimonies from people who have. I've made a lot of friends and contacts in the hunters over the years, and I'm sure some of them would be happy to share their stories too. I know that there's lots of other people like myself who want the world to know and understand our side of the story. Anyway, let's get into it. I'll start with what is probably the most well-known cryptid of all. Sasquatch, aka Bigfoot. These guys are quite common, ranging all across the continental United States, from Canada to Alaska, all the way to Florida. They're also relatively peaceful as quote-unquote monsters, and this makes them one of the few most well-studied species. Us humans have known about and coexisted with Sasquatch for a very, very long time. My Cherokee ancestors and people of other native nations and tribes have legends and stories about Sasquatch that go back thousands of years, far before the European colonization of North America. And for the most part, humans and Sasquatch were able to get along peacefully. Like any interaction between intelligent species, there was the occasional conflict, though, and so my family has a long tradition of stopping violence between our two kinds, one way or another. Sasquatch are generally much like the pictures you have often seen. They look like ape men. Fully grown, they stand anywhere from 6 to 10 feet tall, and weigh anywhere from 300 to upwards of 1,000 pounds. They have a body structure that's very similar to that of a human, except with proportionally longer arms and proportionally larger hands and feet. They are covered in shaggy hair from head to toe, and from what I've seen, they have nearly as much range in their fur color as humans do with our own hair. Most Sasquatch have chocolate brown hair, but it's nearly as common for them to have gray or black fur. Some have reddish, while others almost have blonde or sandy-colored hair. Rarely, Sasquatches can also be ash-colored, almost white, although truly white hair on a Sasquatch only occurs when they're born albino, which can certainly happen. Geography seems to have some impact on color of the hair, but not necessarily the environment or climate. It seems to be more of a population-based thing. For example, take the Sasquatches of the southern and eastern Ohio, often called grassmen. They tend to have reddish-brown fur, and it's likely that their children will look the same. Like humans, Sasquatch hair grows on almost their entire bodies, save for the palms of their hands and the soles of their feet and parts of their faces. Sasquatch social structure is pretty fluid, just like with humans. Usually though, they're solitary creatures, unless they're siblings, bachelors, or a mated pair. But some make groups of up to 20 individuals, although it's very rare to see so many together. For the most part, you can expect to find Sasquatches either alone or in small groups of only a few. The physically strongest one tends to take the lead in groups, and as many, these tend to be older Sasquatches. They've had some time to get to know the land that they live on, where to find food, where humans live, good travel routes, and so on. They teach the younger generation these things and pass on their knowledge. Just like humans, other apes, and some other animals, they are able to teach other things. They're very intelligent, and I'd say they're almost as smart as humans, if not far smarter. I've been told about Sasquatch ever since I can remember, and because my family has been in the hunters for a long time, I learned about all sorts of cryptids and monsters as I grew up. My first personal experience with a Sasquatch wasn't until I was about 9 or 10 years old, though. A long time ago, I know. First, a little background. My mother's side is the Cherokee one, and that side of my family comes from the Cherokee Nation in Oklahoma. My father's black, and he's from Washington State. I'm going to try and keep all the locations in my post relatively vague, both to protect people's privacy and keep the details of cases private. When my parents divorced, I was about 5 years old, and my mother gained full custody of me. So I grew up in Oklahoma with her, mainly. However, my dad would come and take me to Washington about twice or so a year. Although his side of the family wasn't involved with the hunters, they did enjoy regular old deer hunting, so they'd take me out into the woods every so often when I'd go up there, teaching me how to shoot and track and such. Both sides of my family taught me how to enjoy and respect nature, and I'll always be grateful to them for that. It was on one such trip that I first saw a Sasquatch. I won't give away the exact location, but it was in the eastern part of the state, in a densely wooded area. I was trekking along with my dad and grandfather, heading through a valley. The trees were mainly conifers, and I remember it being slightly overcast, but not too hot or too cold. It was just before noon, and I recall being hungry. Suddenly, we heard a knock, and we all stopped walking. Knocks, or tree knocks, are a sound that Sasquatch commonly used to communicate, by stripping the bark off a stick or a log, and then hitting it against a tree trunk. They make these knocking sounds that can carry for great distances through the woods. They use to sound like a person might use a shout, or might yell, "Hey!" The sound advertises the presence of the Sasquatch, and it's often a warning or a statement of power. This time, we heard one very distant knock, and then silence. And I remember my dad looking to my grandfather, and then taking my hand, starting forward again, moving more slowly. I spoke up, asking if that was a Sasquatch, and my dad answered that it probably was. After a minute or so, we heard another knock, closer and louder this time. It seemed to be coming from a ridge to our left, and we all looked in that direction. Animals often like to have high ground in situations, and this was no different. There on the ridge above us stood a Sasquatch, slightly blocked from view behind some bushes, but still visible nonetheless. It was a male, judging by the broad shoulders and bulky frame, and if I had to estimate now, he was probably about 8 feet tall. Although maybe I'm not remembering correctly. He had dark red hair, almost brown fur, and was still carrying the stick he'd used to knock on the tree. His posture was neutral, neither threatened nor threatening. He just stood, watching us, with what seemed like a mixture of curiosity and wariness. My dad held his hands to indicate that he had no weapons, and then turned to me and my grandfather, indicating that we should go back the way we came. We hadn't caught anything that day, but that didn't bother me. I was elated. I had seen pictures and remnants of creatures before, but I hadn't seen a live one that I could remember. That was the first time I'd ever seen a monster alive and active, and I was so happy. I didn't feel scared, although I guess the Sasquatch's appearance was a bit intimidating. I don't think my father and grandfather were scared either. They just wanted to keep all of us safe, and so they decided to head back the way we came in order to let this creature be. For my mother's family, they knew about monsters and such and knew to respect their boundaries. Most people don't know or care about those boundaries, though, and when they cross them, things can get very ugly very fast. A few years later, when I was 13 or so, my mom began taking me with her on some of her less intensive cases to start teaching me the ropes of hunting. We went down to Florida on one of these trips in order to investigate sightings of a skunk ape. Skunk apes are not actually some weird hybrids between skunks and apes. That would certainly be an interesting and cool creature, but the truth is a bit less expecting and exciting than that. Skunk apes are just a subspecies of Sasquatch that inhabit the southeastern U.S., mainly Florida to Louisiana. The name comes from their smell, because, quite simply, they reek. Take the odor of rotten eggs and sulfur, combine them, and increase the power of the stench by about tenfold, and you'll start getting an idea of what skunk apes smell like. They're a bit smaller and lighter in color than most other Sasquatches, with a sort of mane of longer hair on their shoulders and necks. This particular case had been called in because a skunk ape had apparently mauled 2 people. They were brothers who'd been out hunting. They hadn't been killed, but they were severely injured with cracked ribs, fractured skulls, and internal bleeding, which had all been dealt with at a hospital they'd managed to get to. Both had talked about a man-sized ape coming out of the trees and beating them to within inches of their lives, but the official explanation was that a black bear had been responsible for the attack. This is the kind of willful ignorance that really gets to me. If there aren't even claw marks or bite marks on the victims, was it really a black bear? Their injuries were consistent with blunt force trauma, which is exactly what the fists of a Sasquatch will cause. Unfortunately, people just don't want to admit that. Anyway, my mom and I dealt with that case pretty quickly. The skunk ape was a lone female, and her home range was being converted into housing developments. The hunters had been local and were practically hunting in their own backyards. When they'd gotten too close to the skunk ape's nest, she'd lashed out, and even though she hadn't killed the men, she'd still proven herself to be a threat. My mother and I made the decision together that we weren't going to kill her. Instead, we'd tranquilize her and relocate her somewhere safer. Along with my mother's guide, a lady named Hannah, we were able to pinpoint a state park in Alabama where we hoped she'd be able to find a new life. The next day, my mom and I were able to track down the skunk ape and tranquilize her. My mom even let me take the shot. After she dropped, we called in one of the hunter relocation crews to pick her up and take her to her new home. It was a clean job, with no bloodshed necessary. Well, besides the hunters, who were expected to make a full recovery. I love it when things work out that way, even though it is pretty rare that they do. If this first post goes over well, then maybe I'll tell you guys about some of the cases that weren't so clean, and the monsters that caused them. Most of the time with Sasquatches, though, it's pretty simple, since they aren't inherently dangerous or aggressive, towards humans that is. It's usually enough to simply relocate them. There's plenty of empty space across North America, where we can take them to live out their lives without being afraid of humans or hurting them. This goes even for the largest, most aggressive Sasquatches too. One example of this would be a Sasquatch that I hunted back in 1994. I had only been working on my own for a little while at the time, but I had already handled some very tough and aggressive monsters. So when Sergio told me about a Sasquatch wreaking havoc in British Columbia, I figured I'd be more than able to handle it. When I arrived in the province, I immediately picked up a fresh lead on the Sasquatch. 3 people had been killed while camping in the mountains of a local national park. Though the hunters aren't directly part of any government agency, we still have badges and licenses for our organization, and those usually seem official enough to let us go where we need to go. This time, I showed my badge to some park rangers and policemen who were investigating the scene of the killings, and I was let through to examine the area. The 2 women and 1 man had died quickly, it seemed, and hadn't put up much of a fight. The Sasquatch had broken one of the woman's necks, seemingly by grabbing onto her and throwing her into a tree. He had smashed in the heads of the other 2. It wasn't very messy, and I had seen much worse, but it was obviously not pleasant either. Luckily, the Sasquatch had left some prints nearby, and after I gathered my stuff, I headed off into the woods in search of it. The next day, I caught up to it at a small creek. This one was a huge male, definitely over 9 feet in height, with dark gray hair and a physique that would make any professional bodybuilder look twig thin in comparison. He was squatting by the creek, using his hands to scoop water into his mouth. I was downwind of him and slightly uphill on a slight ridge that overlooked the creek. I was in a perfect position. I shot him with a tranquil dart in the side of his neck. Then he began to run some distance away along the ridgeline. I'd take a moment for the tranquilizer to work and didn't want him catching me in that time. The big guy let out a roar of surprise when I shot him. Just like other great creatures, Sasquatch make a variety of noises, and when they're in pain or angry, they give a loud, earth-shaking roar that you can feel in your chest. I hadn't hurt this one, but he was surprised enough to make an enraged bellow. I turned back to see him rise to his feet and take a step backwards, looking around for himself for the source of the dart. He saw me, took a few staggering steps towards me, and then collapsed onto his back with a loud thud. I called in a crew, and soon enough, they arrived to take him to the location I decided upon earlier, a nice safe area far away from human habitation. From my stories, you can hopefully see that these Sasquatches are not just mindless beasts. They have thoughts and feelings just like us, and for the most part, they just like to be left alone. This goes for a lot of creatures, especially ones that are not exactly predatory. If you come across a Sasquatch, it's usually best to just walk in the opposite direction. Don't run, point, flail around, or otherwise make yourself seem obvious or like a threat. Try not to make eye contact with the Sasquatch either. Just keep your head down and walk away, and you'll generally be just fine. They usually attack if they're starving, feel threatened, or if you're near their territory. Any other time, they're very peaceful and gentle and almost curious. If they charge you, you'll almost certainly have to defend yourself. Other animals will do mock or bluff charges to scare off potential foes, but I've never seen a Sasquatch do this personally. Once they charge, for me, they've always seemed to commit to it. You won't be able to outrun them either, so you'll probably wind up fighting. If you're expecting this kind of situation, it's usually best to bring some kind of rifle with high caliber, penetrating rounds. Sasquatch don't have very thick skin, but their hair can be thick, and it often acts as protection against projectiles. The hair around their faces and necks is thinner, and that's where you'll want to shoot. Just like a human, headshots are most effective. I've never had to kill one, but I know hunters who have, and they always say that it's unpleasant. Maybe because they feel that way that Sasquatches are so similar to humans. I'm just thankful I've never had to do it, even though I have had quite a few other unpleasant experiences. I'll tell you about some of those later, if you're interested. Anyway, I think this has been long enough. I'll certainly answer any questions that you ask, and if you want to hear about something in particular, just say so, and I'll see if I can fit it in. For now though, I think I've given you guys a fair bit to think about, so I'll be back soon.